think about it, Polis, every decision he makes, because he thinks 50,000 people are going to die, he's weighing a little bit of freedom and death. And it's just absurd.
All the lockdowns that have happened over the last half year have been based on models. At first I thought those were Victoria's Secret models. No, apparently there's some sort of computer models, but they're alarmist. And we're starting to find out here in Colorado, our modelers are either high or stupid or not telling us the truth. Karl Dierenbach is an engineer. Thank you for being with us. You've spent a lot of time in your lifetime looking at models, looking at data, looking at these things, pulling out numbers. So this is nothing new for you.
Correct. I've worked for Ford Motor Company in manufacturing, pulling out reams of data from manufacturing processes and looking at it and trying to figure out what it can tell you. And that data, you can't be wrong. If you interpret that data wrong and you implement something wrong, you see a wrong result. It's a little different than social modeling.
Right. So in your modeling, particularly with safety systems in cars, if your modeling is off, tens of thousands of people go through their windshield.
Well, potentially. Mostly it was manufacturing. So if my modeling was off, our rates of manufacturing would drop and we wouldn't meet production, and then people would come down and say, hey, we can't ship cars because you aren't making parts.
Just to be fair,
a lot
though,
of pressure.
You're not a doctor.
No.
All right, you're not a medical specialist. You're none of these things, but you do know how to look at data.
Yes.
And would a layperson, someone as dumb as me, be able to look at the same data and come to the conclusions we're about to talk about?
Yes, and when I write, I'm very conscious that I'm not an epidemiologist or a medical doctor. And so when I write, I link to all the data. When I say something, I say, this is why I say this is the data, and I'll compare it to data from perhaps different areas, different countries, different states, and I'll lead someone to the conclusion. I never expect anyone to just read something that I write about coronavirus and say, oh, well, Karl said it, it must be true. It's always backed up.
All right. You wrote a piece for Complete Colorado looking at Colorado's modeling. And the punchline is, we'll start with the punchline and then build me through this.
Okay.
Punchline basically is the fears of 50 to 75,000 Coloradans dying of coronavirus if we do nothing is way off. Is that the simplest way to put it?
Yes, it's way off compared to what the rest of the world is predicting and what the rest of the world is seeing.
And just because you might be an engineer, I'm a political junkie. And I'm seeing the lockdowns that have happened, the closures of schools, all this manufactured panic is based on this idea that if we don't do this, people are going to die. Massive people are going to die. And so when the governors and others look at this and say, hey, we have to do this, otherwise tens of thousands of Coloradans will die. That is a faulty premise, according to you.
Again, I'm not going to make that claim, but I'm going to point to places where it's not happening, it's not close to happening. Nothing near what they predict in Colorado is happening anywhere in the world.
Let's talk about the worst case scenario. Worst case scenario, we heard at the beginning of all the silliness, is if we don't take action now and cripple our economy, close down businesses, close down churches, close down bars and restaurants, up to 70,000 Coloradans will die.
So Colorado's worst case scenario, early on in April, the Colorado modelers put out a study showing that they would see 80,000 deaths in a couple of months. It was frightening, but it wasn't in line with what was happening in the rest of the world. If you remember at the beginning of everything, the Imperial College London put out a model saying that 2.2 million Americans would die if we did nothing. Well, Colorado's share of that 2.2 million is 39,000. So Colorado modelers, for some reason, were thinking that we'd see twice as much death as even the worst case scenario.
Let me stop you there. So the original models, even if we went with a crazy model that said 2.2 million people in the United States would die, that would still be less than 40,000 in Colorado. Yet Colorado modelers said if we do nothing, 80,000 people will die. So 2.2 million Americans haven't died.
Correct.
It's closer to 150,000, 120,000, I'm somewhere in that range. Almost all of them in an older or vulnerable age category.
Yes.
So the original model that this was all speculated about was a crazy model to begin with. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and there were people that were investigating the model. It was made sloppily. That it was 15 years old. They had just patched it. It sounded like to me, an old Datsun or something.
Hey, as a guy who survived on an old Datsun, it's a good model.
That you just start throwing parts on and sort of just somehow keeping it running. And it was panned and it was dropped and people stopped talking about it.
What scares me about this, and again, you look at these things as an engineer, I look at them as a politico. The moral underpinning for taking away our right of free association, of locking down businesses, keeping schools and churches closed, destroying people's lives and livelihoods, was all based on we have to do this to save millions of American lives. And if we don't, we're killing those people. And so that gave government the moral certainty to close down businesses, close down our lives, put us under house arrest. And you're telling us that model was just off by a factor of at least 10.
The one that we use in Colorado seems to be way off. It seems to be just unrealistic, the amount of death that we'd see if we just went back to how we lived in January, especially now that we've seen places like New York who've suffered a tremendous amount of death. But New York itself, New York State, right now is flat. They're having hardly any new deaths from coronavirus, and they're at about 1,700 deaths per million. And if New York were its own country, it would be the worst country in the world for that. The next closest would be Peru, which is like 800 or 900 deaths per million. New York was at 1,700 deaths per million. Colorado modelers think that Colorado would be at 12,000 deaths per million.
Help me out. You're using numbers. I get lost in numbers.
Yeah. That's seven times worse than New York.
All right. So the modelers in Colorado based their scared projections on something that is 7 times worse than what we see in the worst place on the planet for this pandemic, which is New York.
Yes. And so one thing it comes down to is whether you believe New York is finished. A lot of experts are saying that they've had enough infections there, that they've had enough cases, that they've saturated, that they've reached basically herd immunity, or at least some sort of saturation where they're not going to see a lot more cases. If you believe that, then that would be the absolute upper limit that you might expect to see anywhere, because New York has New York City, which is absolute worst case scenario for a pandemic with its density. So Colorado, to think that we're 7 times worse than that is, to me, doesn't make any sense. But if you're...
Is the word you're looking for insane?
Yeah, yes.
All right.
Yes. And that was the Federalist article. I had originally titled it, Insane Colorado Models Lead to Insane Actions, because that's basically what I think is happening now.
And this was an article you wrote for the Federalist,
yes,
and was republished in Complete Colorado.
Well, there's a couple articles in Complete Colorado in April, early on, is when I first brought up that they think 80,000 people were dead. And I like to think that I had some effect, because in the following reports from the COVID modeling group, they no longer talked about how many deaths they were predicting.
So where are we now in Colorado? Have the modelers gone, man, we were off by a factor of at least 10, and probably more?
They've backed off slightly to now, well, one thing is they published an app that Governor Polis specifically said is the model that they use. So you can go onto their website and you can find this app and you can tweak social distancing and mask wearing and try to come up with values and see what happens. If you set everything to 0 now, they will tell you that 55,000 people will die in the next couple of months. So they are still radical. And I even...
Wait. So as we tape this, which might be at a different time than you're watching this, but as we tape this, they are still predicting if we do nothing at all, 55,000 Coloradans would die, which would still be far worse than what's going on in New York City.
Yes.
And closer to the original projections of 80,000, which was just insane.
Yes. Yes. Frightening thought. And
so is it a scare tactic? I mean, you're an engineer. I got to think that people who are good engineers, and what I mean by good engineers are not people who are always right, but people who are actually seeking the truth without a bias. My sense is good engineers, people with those minds, look at that data and go, that's a scare tactic. Or are there engineers who can look at that and go, no, I can see that being a reasonable possibility?
I don't know the psychology of what's going on. If I had to guess, I would say that they originally were earnest in their predictions, that when that London study came out, they did their own study, and somehow they ended up being twice as bad, but they felt honestly that was a problem. And then all the lockdowns and all the social pain that comes along, it's hard, I think, psychologically for some people to back off from that and say, oh, my bad. Sorry about your job. Sorry about your life, right? So they cling on to it. And at this point, I don't know if they're fooling themselves or if they still believe it, but like Polis is saying that nothing's going to change unless there's a vaccine, which would give him a way out, right? Because if we suddenly had a vaccine and everyone had a vaccine and we got that, he could back off everything and everything would be fine. He could say, oh, I did the right thing.
That's what worries me, is that there's no proof of this. So with a scare tactic that if we do nothing, 80,000 Coloradans will die, and we find out that is double a worst case scenario of a model that was at least off by a factor of 10. So in other words, it's off
You've got
wildly. And we say, man, did I take care of that problem? And I remember little kids, they were scared of monsters in their closet. And Dad would come in and scare away all the monsters. And I could look at him and go, good thing I was here, kid. I took care of those monsters. You can sleep well. And I have a feeling that's exactly what our politicians are going to do after all this. Go, oh, our models showed 80,000 people in Colorado would die, and we kept that just a couple thousand because of our great work. And you think that's nuts.
That's nuts. And there's some more insidious things going on with the model too, that it's never wrong. So you're probably thinking, okay, they predicted 80,000 and now they're predicting 57,000. How can they have faith in this model when, for example, Sweden is at like under 600 deaths per million. If we ended up at Sweden's level, Colorado would have a total of about 3,000 deaths, which is about 1,000 more than we have now. So Sweden, who opened up, never locked down, never closed their schools, doesn't wear masks, if we were like them, we might see another third of the deaths that we've seen so far, another 1,000 deaths. We wouldn't be seeing 55,000, 57,000. So you're thinking, how can you possibly look around the world, and then we talked about New York, and think your model is still good? And part of it is because the model's designed so that it gives them information that they want to have, but regardless of what's happening in the real world. And what I mean by that is the model is basically geared to tell them what social distancing level Coloradans did. And then when you have that information, you can then massage what Colorado should do in the future for social distancing. I know it's a little, probably didn't say that clearly enough, but so what happened is early on, things spiked. And the model says, oh, we were at social distancing of 50%. And then hospitalizations peaked and started coming down. And the model, which is based on past hospitalization, said, oh, when we turned that corner, we were social distancing at 80% because we were driving hospitalization down. And then when it leveled off, they said, oh, you got to wait a few days because hospitalizations are a trailing indicator. So they'll say, oh, 13 days ago when those hospitalizations started leveling off, we were social distancing at 70% or some number like that. And so what the model does is it keeps telling them what level we're social distancing. And so when in July they started to rise again, the modeler said, oh no, social distancing is dropping too low and hospitalizations are rising. And so Polis's response was, oh, let's close bars, have last call at 10 p.m. and put on masks. And then the hospitalizations started to turn the corner and come down again. And of course, they claim that it was their actions, but the timing doesn't work.
Are you saying those actions are disconnected from the reality? Are you saying that the masks, lower or earlier closing hours, keeping things closed, did not bring down those rates? That wasn't the primary factor? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I look at hospitalizations because hospitalizations are what it was all about in the beginning. Flatten the curve was all about flattening the curve so that peak illnesses were below hospital capacity so that you wouldn't have to have people come into a hospital and doctors choose who to see and who not to see. That was all flattening the curve was about. And frankly, I was okay with that. I think that's a rather sound philosophy, a rather sound approach. And that's also why it was 15 days slow to spread in the beginning, because 15 days was one cycle. You'd break the cycle of the ever increasing lines, and that was it. So for me, as soon as it went 30 days to slow to spread, I thought it's over. We're done. We're in lockdown forever.
We flattened the curve.
No, I thought that politically we were in lockdown forever, because when you went to 15 days was based on the cycle of the disease. 30 days was based on politics. And I thought, we're done. And then it was 45 days, and now it's 6 months, and it's going to end up being a couple years. But anyway, going back to the model, so you go up, you have this model, and they're saying, oh, social distancing was 80% or 60% or 80%, and they base that on hospitalizations. But they don't, but how do you argue that later on? Like if they say, well, we say social distancing was at 70% for these 3 weeks, who can argue against that, right? You might have an instinct to say, oh, we seem more open up, but there's no argument against it, so it's self-fulfilling. Polis totally believes in it. Over time, at the beginning, he was like, oh, we have this model that helps guide us, and now we have this model that tells us what's happening. But they don't even look at the data. So most glaring example is there were stay-at-home orders, and we were at 80% social distancing. And that was because the hospitalizations were decreasing. And then hospitalizations decreased more, but it was at the time when we were opening up and going from stay-at-home to safer at home. But hospitalizations decreased more, so the model tells us that when we opened up and went from stay-at-home to safer at home, social distancing went from 80% to 87%. So the models are saying that we must have been more reclusive when we were opening up, but nobody questions it.
Bottom line, do it in like 5-10 seconds. So after all this analysis, which again, people should go and look at themselves and come to their own conclusions, the bottom line is what?
Bottom line is we could open up a lot more than we are now. We're not going to see 50,000 people dead. And it is this Polis's absolute fear that he's the one who's deciding how we can. Think about it, Polis, every decision he makes, because he thinks 50,000 people are going to die, he's weighing a little bit of freedom and death. And it's just absurd. He thinks he's walking this tight line, but he's not. If we opened up more, we are not going to see 50,000 people
If we opened up completely, bottom line this, if we opened up completely, how many people would die in Colorado?
That one's hard to say. All I can say is if you opened up like Sweden, meaning drop the masks, drop the regulations, people will still tend to be a little nervous about what's going on. Probably not let events of over 500 people for a while. If we went to that level, completely opened up, no large events, no masks, maybe 1,000 more people would die, and we'd be equivalent of Sweden at that point. My instinct tells me that there's not much beyond there problem-wise, but there's no data to affirm that because no place in the world has gone that loose.
Except Sweden.
Well, Sweden is still limiting. They're just now starting to allow things of over 500, right? They never close their schools, but we could at least go to Sweden and we wouldn't see 50,000 So there's a lot of opening up we could do relative to where we're at now.
Carl, thank you much.
Thanks for having me. It's great.
If you enjoyed that conversation, by all means, click one of these other great programs. We have the best conversations with the most fascinating Coloradans. And subscribe to our channel. Just click down below and hit that little bell button too. You don't want to miss a single show.